English translation, 372nd contact, Friday 14th of January 2005, 55 hours.
Which means that we also talked about that. May I now still ask 2 or 3 questions, provided, of course, that you still have time to answer them?
I am not in a hurry.
Good. You mentioned during the last visit in our private conversation that the U.S. President George W. Bush would again be up to something with regard to Persia, that is to say, Iran. Are you allowed to say more about this in open form?
There is no secret involved. The man Bush is a megalomaniac and firmly convinced that he would be his God's representative on the earth and would have to free the world from all evil. But in his sectarian delusion, he completely suppresses the fact that he himself is probably the evilest terrible thing with regard to war and terror. In this, he is so caught up that he also wants to exterminate everything of other beliefs that does not reflect his own sectarian belief, whereby he has especially focused on the Islam. In this sense, his delusions play the greatest role in that he would have to seize complete might in the Islamic region to bring everything under American and Christian rule. The most obvious thing for him in this regard is that he would have to build a bond of American rule from Afghanistan to Iraq. And between these two states lies only Iran, which is interested in building a nuclear weapons technology. But this is precisely what Bush is using as a deceitful pretext to have plans drawn up for an attack on Iran. He has already acted in the same form in Iraq, although something similar has also been the case in Afghanistan. What will result from this? Unfortunately, is not yet definitively established, because there are still wide-ranging open factors that prevent the entire situation from being seen in a final and unambiguous light. However, it is indisputably certain that U.S.-American secret forces are already operating in Iran and engaged in espionage and so on.
This means that you have not made a foresight?
No. As a rule, we are content with observations and probability calculations. It was only for the purpose of shaking up the Earth humanity that we have made predictions all these years since our first contacts. And you yourself have asked for that. But neither prophecies nor predictions have ever changed anything in the mentality of the earthly humankind. Therefore, all our work in this regard was in vain.
Which unfortunately you are right about. But now and then, I would nevertheless like to ask you for predictions, if you will allow that.
In one case or another, I will gladly do that for you, but it will really only be in individual and specific cases, because we probably better refrain from making predictions about the years ahead. Firstly, this is very laborious and time-consuming for us, and secondly, it does not bring any success, because the human beings of the earth do not care about it after all. On our part, we are content with observing all that is happening in order to draw conclusions from it and make calculations. More is not in our sense, because this is such that we behave correctly in every respect. Shape life correctly and base it on the laws of the creation and handle all things in a progressive and life-advocating, life-worthy, and always correct and just form.
Of course, I have no doubt about that, because that is also the right attitude with regard to all aspects of the life. But now that you are talking about the right behavior, many human beings here on the earth suffer increasingly from the so-called syndrome of being burnt out. That is to say, burnout syndrome, which is caused by conscious or subconscious stress. This means thus that the human beings can suffer from stress even if they have no idea about it, and therefore do not notice that their whole organic system starts to go crazy. For my part, it is clear to me that the antidote can only be calm. Peace, love, physical activity, and harmony and freedom from stress. But it is not clear to me what actually is the trigger of the being burnt out. The stress itself obviously cannot be it, so I have come to think that the stress can only be the origin of an organic phenomenon. Thereby, I have come to the thought that there must actually be a stress hormone that through bodily, mental, feeling-based, and psyche-based overload is released and triggers being burned out. In my opinion, it has to be like this somehow, whereby I think that this stress hormone poisons the whole body. I cannot find another explanation for this, but it could perhaps also be that I am erring.
You are not erring. In fact, there is a steroid hormone that can be called a stress hormone. It is the cortisol synthesized in the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex that gradually disperses throughout the body, causing a body-wide cortisol poisoning and thus a physical and psychical exhaustion. Thereby, a dulling of the thoughts and feelings takes place, whereby a personal incompetence develops. Also, headaches, nausea, fatigue, lack of interest, suicidal thoughts, and dizziness, etc. are the result. Thereby, the stress is based on reactions of excessive strain of thoughts, feeling-based matters and emotions, and on a permanent tension, whereby especially situations which offer only a limited scope for action produce particularly burdensome effects.
Speaking of poisoning, one more question comes to my mind. It has been said since time immemorial that King Alexander III of Macedonia, that is to say, Alexander the Great, was murdered by poison in Babylon. However, Quetzal explained to me in 1984 that this would not correspond to the truth. He told me that at the age of almost 33, the king had fallen ill with the West Nile virus during his war campaigns in Babylonia, namely in Babylon in the year 323 BC, whereby he had been treated by his doctors with all kinds of healing juices and beverages. One of the juices would have been a brew of white hellebore, and this brew would have finally led to the death. If I remember Quetzal's words correctly, the brew was used to irritate Alexander's throat several times a day with a buzzard feather soaked in it to induce a vomiting. The opinion of the doctors at that time, always according to Quetzal, was that it was assumed that vomiting would be extremely beneficial against fever, headaches, nausea, and cramps, as well as all kinds of other terrible things. This procedure with white hellebore would then have caused the death of Alexander the Great after 12 days or so, which, however, had not been intended by the doctors. White hellebore, or simply false helleborine, as the plant is called, grows in many countries and is highly toxic. And to my knowledge, the poison also finds use in homeopathy, especially for diarrhea with vomiting, dysentery, as well as for collapse states and circulatory weaknesses. For my part, I know the plant from the Alps and the Pyrenees, as well as from the Jura, where the white hellebore belongs to the typical flora, of which basically everything is very poisonous. So the rootstock and the roots, as well as the whole stem, leaf, and flower structure. And what else has to be said about Alexander the Great? He was a murderer without thinking, who himself murdered his best friends at will and was immensely addicted to conquering, which is why he also created a gigantic empire through campaigns of conquest, which spanned from Macedonia to Egypt and as far as Persia and India, and that within only a few years, from 336 to 323 BC, during which he was king, everywhere he designated the capital cities after his name, namely Alexandria or Alexandropolis. If I remember the history lessons correctly, he was born in Pella, Macedonia, Greece, in 356 BC. His father was King Philip II of Macedonia, who was treacherously murdered, which Alexander was able to witness secretly, which subsequently shaped him into a multiple murderer himself, but which did not prevent him from being a scholar of Aristotle. But now the question, why should Alexander the Great have died unintentionally due to the brew white hellebore, if the brew was actually used as a medicine? Do you know anything about that?
White hellebore, that is to say, false helleborine, belongs to the family Liliaceae, and thus to the lily family. The plant goes by the Latin name Veratrum album Linn, and is indeed very poisonous. In prehistoric Greece, white hellebore, that is to say, Veratrum album, was the most important medicinal plant altogether. It was regarded as the central medicine of the herbalists, the root diggers, for whom the plant was regarded as carrier of magical powers. Hence, they approached the plant only using shamanic rituals. White hellebore was considered a holy plant of the gods. Snuff powder was the most important application of the root, and thus found a nasal use to induce artificial sneezing, which was intended to cause disease spirits and disease demons to escape from the sick body. The poisonously active substances of the plant are steroid alkaloids and steroid-like alkaloids, with 3 ester alkaloids to be mentioned as the main active substances, namely germarin and protoveratrine A and B. But to answer your question now, Alexander the Great was indeed not murdered but died due to a so-called medical professional error. The king was indeed infected by the West Nile virus, lay seriously ill, and was treated by his personal physicians with all kinds of ointments, decoctions, and brews. And in fact it happened the way Quetzal explained to you, that Alexander the Great was being treated daily with a white hellebore brew. Just as you said, a bird of prey feather was dipped 2 to 3 times a day with the tip into the brew to then be inserted into the king's mouth. Thereby the palate was tickled until a vomiting occurred. This procedure was repeated daily for about 12 days, causing Alexander the Great to be unintentionally poisoned in small amounts without receiving a lethal dose all at once. In this manner, the poison was slowly accumulated in his body, and namely until the dosage was that large that the man died. Still to explain is that with an intake of 1 to 2 grams of dried powder white hellebore, and with higher fever, the entire arrangement brings forth a deadly effect. In smaller quantities, white hellebore can very well serve as an effective medication.
Eerie to have to die like this. When I think of how the man must have suffered, regardless of whether he was a multiple murderer or not.
It is not to be wished on anyone.
Exactly, that is what I think as well. But let me have a question about the English translations. What language form should we use, the American English or the British English?
You should absolutely refrain from the American English, because it is a low-brow, uneducated, and uncultivated language that does not correspond to the values of your books and all your writings. Therefore, a cultivated English should be used for all translations, and that cultivated one is found only and exclusively in the British English. And that you act accordingly, and thus use the British English is our wish and desire.
Thank you. That helps us a lot. Hence we will follow your instruction, which is hidden behind the desire and wish. What I'm now also interested in. Has there been anything new regarding the deaths from the seaquake disaster in Indonesia, Thailand, India, Africa, and Sri Lanka? Have you been gathering additional data since the 31st of December 2004?
Yes, that is the case. The most recent work on this was carried out yesterday at 1810 HRs, when we extended the entire area for data recording considerably, both at sea and on land. This has enabled us to obtain additional data, which showed another large number of biograms of human beings who died on the 26th of December 2004 as a result of the disaster. Furthermore, a number of 2,312 human beings arose who lost their lives retrospectively from the 31st of December 2004 until yesterday evening at 1810 hours due to the indirect effects of the disaster. This figure includes both those who died as a result of illnesses caused by the catastrophic circumstances and those who committed suicide as a result of their very precarious situation or out of sorrow over the loss of their loved ones. Thus, until yesterday evening at 1810 hours, a total figure of 359,796 killed human beings arises. But that does not have to be the final figure, because in the course of time to come, there may be an additional number if diseases and suicides still claim human lives. That the responsible authorities of all affected countries will ever be able to determine the exact number of deaths on Tuesday, the 22nd of March 2005, will be almost impossible for them.
That is to be assumed. But if I may now nevertheless ask you whether you might still make a foresight for us with regard to the plans of the USA and Persia, that is to say Iran, what would you say then?
You are tireless. In addition, I think that it will not bear any valuable fruits if I do that, because the Earth humans do not let themselves be taught by predictions, as you know. We have meanwhile accumulated about 30 years of experience in this regard, and have experienced in our lives that warnings are fruitless.
Anyway, one must never give up hope. When I think of all the events that took place in Afghanistan and Iraq under the government of the sectarian and delusional warmonger George W. Bush, the President of the USA, then it is reasonable to expect him to continue his work of death and destruction in Iran as well. That, however, could under certain circumstances really lead to the Third World Fire, which could after all be possible in 2006 according to old prophecies. But let us hope that some things of this prophecy will turn for the better. You know the hope. However, what do you think the chances are? Have the cards not yet been distributed?
Everything is still open, but under President Bush's bloody, sectarian, belligerent, and destructive dictatorship, the Earth humanity has very bad cards. For our part, we have only very vague hopes that this man will still be able to bethink himself and free himself from his delusion that he should be the savior of earthly humanity. Together with his direct advisor, Condoleezza Rice, who is also sectarian and megalomaniac, he forms a team of evil that can indeed lead earthly humanity into a third world fire in an imperious, megalomaniac, and completely irresponsible manner.
That is how I see it too. But what about making a foresight regarding what has been said? Perhaps it would nevertheless be useful.
You are tireless, I already said that. However, it shall be as you wish.
Thank you, my friend. Actually, I have asked everything for today.
Then we should still turn a little to the purely private things.
You probably mean the lessons in Swiss German, I suppose? But you speak that Zürichdeutsch, Swiss German dialect spoken in the Zurich area, so well that one might think that you would be ein Zürcher Liebhaber, one who was born and raised in the Zurich area. You do not even have an accent.
That is because of my mother tongue.
I see. Since we have been talking together in Zürichdeutsch, I must translate everything into written German language when I intake the contact reports.
I know that, but that does not cause you any difficulties. Because when I read through the written contact reports each time, I am astonished again and again at how correctly you translate the sense of our conversations into the German language. But let us now transition to continuing my studies.
Your wish is my command. Well then,